So I assume everybody has now the pop-up message about the recording. We'll put it on our website so people can access it. If you like, it would be awesome if you introduce yourself in the chat so everybody else knows who is here. That would be very kind. Also, if you have any questions, if there's an abbreviation you don't know, put it in the chat. We have some experienced advocates trying to follow up with that immediately. If you have follow-up questions for the senators, questions you would like us to ask him, put them in the chat. We'll try to get to them in the second half and try to get to as many as possible. An hour is brief, but we'll definitely try. We'll also try to end pretty much on point at 8:30 to be respectful of everybody's time, but we'll leave the meeting open, hang out for another 30 minutes. If you want to come off camera, talk a little bit to give you that opportunity. And if you have any feedback, anything you liked, anything we maybe should do differently for the next event, let us know at legislation@oregonpta.org. And with that, I'll stop sharing the screen. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our guest for tonight, Senator Michael Dembrow. Very welcome, and thank you so much for being here. For those of you who may not know Michael, let me give you a very brief introduction. Michael Dembrow is the state senator for District 23, which covers parts of Northeast, Southeast Portland, and the very tiny city of Maywood Park. He was first elected by voters 16 years ago, served in the House from 2008 till 2013, when he was appointed to the Senate seat he is holding today. Amongst many other assignments, to his current assignment is chair of the Senate Education Committee, the Joint Ways and Means Subcommittee on Education, and he is also the co-chair of the Joint Task Force on Statewide Educator Salary Schedules. Say that 3 times fast. He is currently also serving with the National Conference of State Legislators as the vice chair of their Education Committee and as a co-chair of their Task Force on Higher Education. But he's not just a legislator. Michael is also a retired English instructor at Portland Community College, PCC, and served as the president of the PCC Faculty Union for 16 years. And we're not done yet. From 2006 to 2008, he's also served on the State Board of Education. Thank you, Michael, for being here with us tonight and for your willingness to share some of your wisdom with us. I would love to start by looking back, maybe some lessons learned, before we go into the current debate about school funding and some of the more thornier issues. So let me start by asking you, you've served in the legislature for 16 years. Thank you for your service. What are the biggest changes you've seen in regards to both school funding, but also the schools themselves? Is there something you wish you had learned sooner?
That is a very good question. So first of all, let me say thank you for inviting me here. And thank you all for being here and for caring about schools and, you know, either your kids or your grandkids or other kids' education throughout the state. I want to start off by giving a big congratulations to Salem Kaiser for apparently settling their contract. That is really wonderful news. They came close, and it's, you know, I know at the end of the day, both sides had to make concessions, but I hope that those were concessions that they can live with and that in any case, avoid the kind of prolonged strike situation that we saw in Portland. So, boy, putting on my time journey hat, going back 16 years, something you have to know is that my entry into the legislature, this shows you what a lucky person I am, coincided with the Great Recession. I came into, well, when I was campaigning, I had wonderful plans for how we were going to move most of our tax credits over to school funding year by year. And, looking over the next few years, fully fund education and fully fund our quality education model, which I'll talk more about later, I'm sure. Instead, we had to cut $4 billion from the budget that year. And that was just a huge shock. Fortunately, two things came out of that. In order to mitigate that reduction, we took measures to the ballot. Some of you will remember measures 66 and 67 in order to try to get a little more revenue into the state. And it did pass. They were both taxes on, one was a corporate tax, the other a tax on wealthiest Oregonians. Small but important. But what we did that I think in the long run is equally and even more important is we created the Education Stability Fund. We knew that we did not want to be in this situation again, where we would, find ourselves having to make such dramatic cuts, which, many of you remember, it took us years to claw our way out of. And so we did do that. And I'm proud to say that we had the discipline to, to stick to it every biennium and to continue to put money into that, as well as our rainy day fund. And, both of those funds, I will say, were designed to deal with the worst case scenario of something of the magnitude of the Great Recession, a $4 billion kind of reduction. But one of the open questions that's still before us, we don't really have policy, I don't think, on when is it raining? And, it feels like every biennium we hear that it's raining, it's time to delve into it. Obviously, it's not raining in the same way that it was in 2010, 11. But somehow we need to come up with some policy, I think, to decide, okay, when is it appropriate and necessary to take funds out of that? Right now, that will happen once it's fully funded, but that's still a few years away. So that was, looking back on sort of key moments in my experience with education funding, that would be the first, I think, the creation of the Stability Fund. The second was in 2017 when we created the corporate activities tax in order to create the Student Success Fund. The corporate activities tax, a very stable tax on corporate revenues, not corporate income. We also have a corporate income tax, but this is just on revenues for some of the larger businesses. And this was very controversial, as many of you will remember. One of the challenges that we face in the Oregon legislature is that by constitution, for us to pass any kind of tax or revenue increase, we need a 3/5 majority of both chambers, which means, in effect, that it's got to be bipartisan. And that is a huge challenge, frankly. We were able to do it in that instance. It required us to make some major changes in our PERS system that were very difficult and, I'll just say was very difficult. But we did it because we knew that we had to create this Student Success Fund, and so we did. The third experience with, with funding that I would point to is, fairly recent one, and that is the federal dollars that came into the state as a result of COVID, the so-called ESSER funds, which brought a lot of money into the state. But, some came directly to the legislature. Others, as you know, went directly to schools and allowed for the creation of some really good programs, or in some cases allowed districts to make long needed improvements to their ventilation systems and other things that were really required by, in response to COVID. And that was, in many cases quite transformative. The challenge there, of course, is those are one-time dollars, and districts are already struggling with how to wean themselves off of those dollars. When you have programs that are created that work, it's hard to let them go. And they come across then as cuts, as layoffs, right? Which are very difficult, very painful. I don't need to tell you that. But that's something we're still living through, frankly. The fourth thing that I would point to is the kicker. And no, I'm not talking about the kicker that most of you think of when you think of the kicker. That is the individual kicker, which is perhaps already made some of you rich in terms of if you filed your taxes. I'm being facetious there, but rather the corporate kicker, which the voters did put into the Constitution as dedicated to the state school fund or to education in general. The legislature went on to decide that those dollars should go to the state school fund, which, looking back on it, I think was a mistake, actually. This is something I've talked about to some of you, because the kicker is going to vary from year to year. And, in the recent past, and the reason I point to it is we have largely funded our K-12 education. Certainly we did last session, and to some extent the session before, thanks to record corporate kickers. Last year's corporate kicker was $1.5 billion. And that essentially funded the increase that we were able to put into schools. Believe it or not, the corporate revenues or corporate income revenues continue to be rising in this state, despite what you might hear elsewhere. And right now we're still looking at a hefty corporate kicker for next year. Right now it's at $500 million, which is, it's nothing like the last one, but it's still among the highest. So that will help. But what that means is, compared to last year, we start next session $1 billion in the red, in a sense. And we need to find the dollars to make up for that. So those are four things that I would point to, and in my 16 years that have both given me great excitement and great trepidation.
Yes. And now we're in a situation with school funding where I think many of the people here on the call would agree that where our children are still struggling, especially coming off of COVID, but not just that. I don't think both the academic results are where we want them now, nor is the mental health, the behavioral issues that we're seeing where we want them to be. So federal monies are going away. The corporate kicker is going to be smaller. How do we fix this? So what's your perspective on the current funding, and where do we go from here? What are you hoping for to see in 2025? Yeah.
Yeah. So fortunately, I won't be in the legislature in 2025.
Yes,
so other people are going to have to actually fix this. But what I'm trying to do before I leave is give us more clarity on our funding. And not only our funding level and how we compare to other states and what it looks like, if we look at it over time, but also how those revenues are being spent. And I'll give you an example. We have a funding formula that basically funds on a per child basis, right? Per student basis, with added weights for students who have particular needs, or where they face barriers of various sorts, more attention needs to be given to them. And so districts get money based on those weights, those weighted FTE, as they're called. It's not clear necessarily that those dollars are being spent on those students by every district. We need more clarity around that. And we need more transparency and accountability of, what districts are doing with the funding. I think we all have a sense generally that more investments should lead to more progress, right? For students. And I think roughly everybody agrees that that's the case. But, the extent to which the students who need the resources the most are getting those resources is still, I think, an open question. And that's something that we are going to try to have answered before the next session begins. And that's as a result of some legislation that we just passed, which is bringing in some national experts to, take a good national comparative kind of look. It's going to be modernizing the QEM so that the QEM becomes something more than just a ritual, but actually is really giving us the information that we need, and is tailored to different students, different school situations.
If I might jump in there,
Yeah.
talking about the QEM, the quality education model, kind of what comes up in your mind what does that mean to you? Kind of what kind of school do you see when you think of a fully funded or funded to the QEM level kind of school? How does that school look like to you?
I don't know the answer to that, Robin,
Okay.
to be honest. And I'm not sure, to be honest, that anyone really does. I think there is broad agreement, especially within the Quality Education Commission, which works to identify the QEM, the quality education model. There's a widespread sense that it needs modernization. What it does is it comes up with scenarios for 3 schools. And what is it that distinguishes these schools, these typical schools? One is small, one is medium, one is large.
Yeah.
Does that really fit the real world that we live in terms of, the importance, I think, of geography? There are differences that rural schools face, that urban schools face, that suburban schools face, depending on what their student population looks like. Those all really need to be looked at. And I think, to be honest with you all, I suspect looking at those is going to identify even greater need than than is in the model. But I think it's really important, especially if we're going to, at some point, try to get more revenue. We need real clarity on, what it is we're trying to achieve.
Yeah.
So the QEM for legislators has always been a target that we try to move towards. I just put up in the chat a link to a presentation that was given to us last year by the Quality Education Commission that looks at the history of the QEM since it was first formulated. The goal of the QEM is to, once, assuming that it's identifying what is needed to get us to a 90% graduation rate, which that is kind of the methodology of it. How are we doing? Obviously, if you look at the very early years, you'll see that the legislature was 36% short. The gap between what was deemed to be needed and what we were providing. There was a 36% gap, which was very difficult to swallow. And so, to its credit, I think the legislature has made a goal of chipping away at that over time. And that did have a lot to do with us creating the Student Success Act and going through all of that political heartache back in 2017. And you'll see that it did make a difference, together with the gradually increased investments following the Great Recession. It brought the gap down. I mean, depending on how you parse the numbers, to almost zero. Yeah. And then last year, the QEC decided that actually the QEM needed $2 billion more. And so the gap, instead of continuing to close, despite the $1 billion plus that we put into it in addition last year, actually the gap grew. And I will say in all candor that created some unhappiness among my colleagues to see that kind of jump overnight. What we need, and I think, however the QEM is decided, I think we can all agree that what we need is something that is a predictable kind of target that we can, create a long-term strategy to close. And having something so unpredictable created some angst. I will say on their behalf, though, something did happen between those two QEMs, and that was COVID.
Yeah.
And I think they did correctly identify that there were going to be increased needs as a result of the COVID experience, as well as having to cope with inflation, frankly.
Yeah.
So,
and that's a good moment to plug our next meeting in April, where we'll have John Wexford, who's the chair of the Quality Education Commission, to go even further in there. So we have a funding gap. I think we all agree on that. And I would like a really simple answer on this, like whose fault is that? Do we have like a villain in this story? Is it a Democratic Republican issue? Is it the urban-rural divide? Is it the co-chairs of Ways and Means? Like, please give us some names if you can.
Okay, they're all dead. How's that? No,
okay.
No. I really don't think it's so much an issue of who as what, right?
Okay.
I mean, we have competing needs, and education is always way, way up on the priority list, right? But we also have, we have housing and, the addictions crisis. We have homeless youth. We have many other priorities that touch youth directly, right? I mean, we're not gonna achieve the student success that we need just simply through K-12 investments. We also need to be investing in housing and healthcare and all of those kinds of supports as well. Those have been growing a lot lately. We've become, just the need has grown. And that too, I don't need to tell you that with COVID, all of those other needs, ballooned equally. And so the question becomes, even as we are continuing to give record amounts of dollars to the state school fund in combination with the Student Success Act, yet the share of the total budget that's going to education has not been increasing. In fact, it's been going down somewhat. And that's because of these other needs that we have had. And, they're clear priorities, I'm sure, of you all as well. So the question then becomes, what can we do within existing resources? and the alternative being add resources. And that, for the reason that I mentioned before, the requirement for a 3/5 majority in the legislature is very difficult. And I will add to that, what we had to do with the Student Success Act is not only get the bipartisan votes that were needed for it, which required, some compromises that were very difficult in other areas. But we also had to convince the business community not to refer that measure to the voters, because that is something that's very easy to do here in Oregon as well. Whatever the legislature passes can immediately be referred to the voters I mentioned measures 66 and 67. Those were real exceptions to what our history has been with attempts to change our revenue system. I look back to, all the hours that I spent door knocking in the 90s and the early 2000s, just getting beaten down each time, trying to create a sales tax for the state to try to give us that three-legged stool that most states have, or to keep the kicker out of the Constitution. And we failed in all of those. And it's possible that something could go to the voters and the voters would support it. But, I don't know. It is a real challenge. Yeah, repeal the kicker, sure. But, again, that will require the Constitution, the voters to pass that in the Constitution. It's a challenge. Yeah.
I want to go into a few specific issues. And one huge issue, which we probably could spend a whole hour on, special needs.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
And federal mandates that are wildly underfunded. And obviously, we need to have a discussion with our federal legislatures on that. But yeah, what do you think? I know there were some bills this short session in the legislature. What are your thoughts on special needs, special ed?
Yeah, and let me just say there were some bills this session. They were never, there was never really an expectation that they would pass in this short session, but they were important to put out there to start the conversation. And I am hoping that something can be done in the long session around special education. It's a burgeoning requirement. The federal government has put expectations on us without giving us the resources to do it. Having said that, I totally agree with their expectations. All kids deserve access to a full school day and the the kind of education that's appropriate for them. It is very, very spendy. And where we're having challenges with our educator workforce, frankly, is with special education teachers and maybe even more so instructional assistants. And, one of the things I think we need is, in order to recruit and retain into that workforce, we're going to need to give them some extra incentives to do that, whether it's in the form of a differential pay or, more bodies in the room. It is something we absolutely need to do. Now, I will say that special ed really doesn't exist within the quality education model. That's something that I believe needs to be added to it if we want to have a real true sense of the true needs of education. That needs to be included. I don't know how many of you know that because we don't have enough money, we limit the amount of those extra weights that can go for special ed students. And right now, Special ed can only get 11% more. That there's a cap of it, in the state school fund. Washington, to their credit, and I think, I see them as a model here.
The state.
The state, yeah, unfortunately, yes, the state, our neighbors to the north, they decided a few years ago that they would start chipping away at that and gradually lift that cap. They got it up to 15%, and this year, just last month, they raised it further to 16%. That is what we need to do as a state. We're not going to do it overnight would cost, I think the estimate is $250 million per year. I think it may even be to remove the cap entirely. And so, I think that's just not going to be possible. But we need a strategy for raising it, each year. Yeah.
And talking about things that are really expensive, let's talk about school buildings.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the state of them. And where so much of the discussion is rightly focused on the operational cost because the state is much more involved in that. But we have buildings, and I'm in Southwest Portland, where we had just a storm that made them inhospitable. But I know other parts of this state have also buildings that are close to the end of their lifespan and have great difficulties replacing them. So what do we do about that?
Yeah,
All easy questions tonight.
Yeah, you're pushing my buttons here, Rob. But arguably, there is some evidence that Oregon does a pretty good job of funding its schools. Don't throw anything at me. I'm glad we're on Zoom here. Relative to other states, just relative to our state GDP, the amount that of our, what we are able to do just by the size of our state and the size of our economic activity. We're actually considered to be among the better states. But where we are definitely among the worser states is in terms of supporting infrastructure. We're one of, I think there are only 13 states that don't really pay for school infrastructure. We don't. And maybe once in a while, if there's an emergency or something, the state will. One of the things I was able to do, I think it was back in 2015 or 2016 with my then colleague, Representative Alyssa Kenny Geyer. Some of you will remember her. We created a fund to help schools with lead abatement, lead, radon, asbestos, those things, called the, I think, Safe and Healthy Schools Fund. But beyond that, the state really doesn't do anything. And we need to. This is an issue that is important for student health. Students can't learn when the ventilation is poor. I guess, COVID investments may have helped some districts there. But at the loss of putting those dollars into tutoring and summer programs and some other things that, I kind of wish they had put the dollars into. My own preference, and I actually had a bill to do this in the last session, but it didn't work. Was to again, going back to the corporate kicker, to reserve the corporate kicker to one-time expenditures, and for example, school upgrades. That would have given us $1.5 billion, to do that. I still think that needs to become a priority for the state, using its bonding authority, to, it does that for universities. It does it to some extent for community colleges, but it doesn't do it for K-12. That's seen as a local requirement. Some districts, have been able to pass bonds, and many have not.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into another very difficult question of the just kind of the metro areas or the more urban and richer with a richer tax base district and the districts where that's not existent. And in Portland, PPS has a big bond that is hopefully paying for some new high schools. We have lots of bonds across the state that are failing at the ballot with the voters. And yeah, how do we, these different approaches to taxation, the underlying economic factors, that's very difficult to solve. From your 16 years in the legislature, what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think so when we changed our school funding system, moving it away from local tax bases to shift the burden over to the state, and then equalize the distribution from the state school fund across all districts in an effort to create an equal playing field for all kids in the state. That was a great goal. And I still believe in it really strongly. But we have, of course, been sort of gradually slipping away from that, where some districts have local option tax bases, tax levies, which is great that their voters have been able to step up and do that. It's obviously much easier for a district like Portland because we have so much economic activity here that the cost of a levy is much lower. The per household cost is much lower than it is where the only buildings that exist are homes. They're not businesses. And so it's really hard for, many parts of the state to do it. But, you have a district like Portland, and Portland is feeling, I know many of you are probably Portland parents, and you're feeling like you're not getting enough money. But, you have Salem Kaiser, who is saying, well, this system, if we only were getting as much as Portland is, we would be okay. And, of course, the response to that is, well, pass a local option. But, that's easier said than done, of course. There are many districts that, they just, for whatever reason, they don't believe in raising taxes. The voters are opposed to that. And so it's a real challenge when you're a school board leader and you know what your kids need, you know what your buildings need, but you're facing a situation where you just can't get there with your local voters.
Yeah, indeed. I want to come to some audience questions, but I haven't seen too many in the chat yet. So I'll give you all, I have some lightning questions for Michael to answer in 30 seconds or less, while you come up with more questions that I would like to ask. So name a strength and or weakness of schools in Oregon. What's a strength? What are we doing well?
Well, I would say that, largely speaking, people still believe in their schools. And I think we have a lot of parents who really believe in their schools, who believe in public education. Oregon continues to have a much lower number of kids in private schools than many, if not most states. But I do think that for various reasons, they're losing patience. I do, but that's not actually, one thing I want to point out in terms of one of the challenges that we face is we're becoming increasingly aware of the problem of chronic absenteeism in this state. Oregon is one of the worst states in the country for its students' attendance levels. We have, this is, COVID has definitely exacerbated this, but it was true in Oregon even before COVID, that we just, for whatever reason, many kids are missing too many days of school. We have I've just created a work group that's looking at this problem. My colleague, Representative Hua Nguyen, who represents parts of East County. This is actually her day job. And so I've asked her, and her day job is to address the challenges of chronic absenteeism in North Clackamas ESD. I've asked her and my vice chair of the Education Committee, who's Senator Suzanne Weber from Tillamook, to work together on this issue, and they're taking it on. I'm hoping we can come up with some good solutions.
Yes, that's definitely a topic that's been on a lot of folks' minds. There are some questions coming up that I'm going to throw at you from the chat. The first one is from Joanne. How can families and community partners advocate for, this chat is moving too fast, advocate for transparency and spending that will help the legislature have a more accurate picture of what is needed? Is that something families and parents and partners can actually do? What is the help that's needed? What would we be looking for? I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would be helpful as we're having this work being done, by, the experts, to also be hearing, firsthand from people in the field, what they're seeing as what their kids are not getting. If they can, pinpoint it to, if only we had X,
Yeah.
my kid would be more successful. I think that would be very helpful, and we need to figure out a way to get that information. And I have to say, I would love to partner with the PTA on this, as well as other, support groups that are out there. I think that would be great.
Of course.
I do think I saw Otto put something in about the levy, the teacher levy, the Portland Public School local option. Definitely that needs to pass. And I think it will pass. Certainly if people, so everybody really needs to make it a priority to make sure that that their friends, their families all vote for it. But what's going to make it easier is that it's just a renewal. So they're not going to actually be paying more than they currently are. There was interest at one point of the legislature changing the way we do the local option that would have allowed them to go for an even higher level. Right now, they're at their max.
Yeah.
But there's not total confidence, as I understand it, that the voters would be willing to pay more. And that's something that I think, parents really need to, where we could use active parent support there. I think the legislature would be willing to raise the cap. It would be controversial. And I will say there's a part of me that doesn't like it, only because it will only serve to exacerbate that gap between the haves and the have-nots in the state. But, at the same time, yeah. Okay, so I'm being hypocritical here.
Christy, I saw your question. I'm going to keep that for last because I think it's a good closing question. Just one of those lightning round questions, kind of name a thing that you think that all schools should do or have, but that you're not seeing them do yet.
I think all schools should have school-based health centers. It's something we here in this area, I think we're fortunate the county has stepped up and, we have them. But in many parts of the state, we do not. I was visited during the session a month ago by a group of students who were advocating for more, well, for school-based health centers in other parts of the state. And they were all kids who were experiencing mental illness and were just very, eloquent and persuasive about the value that having a health center there on campus that they could go to, when they needed it, and get, quality first-rate care, but without the stigma of, that it would take, then the difficulty of having, to leave school, to go to a therapist, etc. Just how important that was for them. And that, I think, that's something that, I would like to see us do more of. And again, these are dollars, whether they're K-12 dollars or they're Oregon Health, uh, you know,
Medicaid.
Medicaid dollars, whatever. We need to make that happen.
Yeah, I love that. How often do you visit schools in your district, and what did you see on your last visit?
Well, actually, my last visit, no, not my last, my very last visit, I saw a bike bus, and that was great. This group of kids going with some parent chaperones on their bikes to school, and I actually joined them. It was a lot of fun. And then the time before that was a visit to a student health center, actually, as I just mentioned. I go a couple of times a year, I would say.
And
I
anything
try
you,
to, and it's obviously it's different when it's a grade school as when it's a high school. But it's been really good seeing it firsthand, and yeah.
yeah. I saw one more question pop up from
I
Ashley
think
before
there's
we
a
get.
few more in here. Yeah, you got them all.
Yeah, and now that time is running out, you throw up questions, people.
Yeah, of course.
There is, I think, an amendment, a draft amendment about requiring the state to fully fund the QEM. Is that an effort you think is worthwhile to push through? Similar to, I think, what I believe Washington has to say, the state needs to fund the QEM, no question asks.
I mean, if that's what the voters want, but again, if we're talking about ultimately an inadequate tax base, then I would hope people would ask themselves, what do we cut in order to do that? Right. And I mean, that's one of the challenges with a tax measure like that. I mean, a constitutional change like that is if it doesn't come with additional funds, the challenge is the voters really don't need to take any responsibility for, what it's going to take and what the unintended consequences of it might be. In principle, I agree with it. But, I think my own preference would be something similar to what we've been trying to do. And that is, come up with, I mean, I think we need a 10-year plan here to, gradually get us where we need to go. And I will say I've been in conversation with the governor and her staff about thinking in those terms. And I'm getting a sympathetic ear because, it's hard to see that we could just come up with all the resources we need overnight. But if you're looking long term, one of the real challenges that we have as a legislature is that we budget on a biennial basis. And it's really hard for us to bind future legislatures. And so to do the kind of long-term thinking and planning and strategizing that we need to, it makes it very hard. It's not impossible, but I think we really need to think in those terms.
Gary Holland has a quick question. Maybe we can get to that really quickly, is about, does the state prioritize graduation rates versus proficiency? Maybe also something to take offline for a longer conversation. It seems a complicated question, but do you want to
I do want to say,
answer?
I do want to say that I'm sympathetic to that, to the extent that, you know, I think it's limited for the QEM to just look at graduation rates. I do think that we also need to be looking at what happens after graduation, right? And so here's something that you're not really going to want to hear, but one of the reasons I think that K-12 is challenged as it is because we're not investing enough in pre-K and quality childcare, and then we are also dramatically underfunding post-secondary education. Our college and university tuition rates are among the highest in the country, certainly the highest in the West. And so when we're talking about competing dollars, traditionally, in order to fund K-12, we've taken the dollars from post-secondary. And there we have really dug ourselves into a hole. But anyway, going back to the original question, Gary's question pushed a button in me. I do think we need to include in the quality education model what students are able to do after they graduate. It's not just the fact of graduation. It's what they can do with their diploma and, what they're doing with their next steps.
So that brings us to our final question. And I'll use the phrasing that Christy used in that question. Now, you said there's general support in the legislature. There's soft support for education and K-12 funding. How do we get the legislature to actually advocate for more funding and get on that path to fully funding education we needed?
Well, I think if what we're talking about is more revenues, then, as I think I've suggested, that's going to require a bipartisan approach. And it's going to require strong support from your counterparts in the more rural parts of the state. And, something that PTA could really help with, since you are statewide, is building that level of support in the more rural parts of the state. If rural parents are pushing, and you know how it is here in Oregon, the rural parts of the state tend to be Republican, the more urban and suburban areas more Democrat. But if we can get that kind of support, because remember, most of my Republican colleagues have run on platforms of no new taxes, period. And it's, without that kind of strong advocacy and push from the base, it's going to be hard to get them on board. But I think ultimately that is what we need.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take that as the closing statement. I do want to kind of, thank you again so much. I have some things to share with everyone. And as I said, we're going to also hang out a little bit longer. Let me share my screen here. And as I mentioned, we have more conversations like tonight coming up. On April 25th, we'll talk with John Rexford, who's the chair of the Quality Education Commission. On May 22nd, we'll talk with Morgan Allen from COSA, which is the Coalition of School Administrators, the superintendents mostly, and Jackie Olson from the Oregon Association of School Business Officials, if I got that one right. And we'll talk about what's called the current service level. What do schools need right now? So in April, we'll talk about what schools need. In May, we're going to talk about what they have. Spoiler alert, it's less than they should. We'll also talk then in probably June with the School Board Association, the school board perspective, And after a short break in July and August, September, we have our educators coming up to really talk that classroom perspective and school perspective. And we're hoping to invite maybe a national expert also to chat with us and give us the outside of the state perspective. And then in October, we're going to have a bigger event. We call it From the Capitol to Our Classrooms, the conference. It's going to be Friday the 25th. It's going to be half-day workshops, trainings to really show what we can do as parents, as community, looking into the long session in 2025. So October 25th, preparing for 2025. And then also some outside of this little event series, a couple of things I wanted to promote. There's the Oregon PTA Convention coming up, which is on April 26th and 27th in Hillsborough. Sign up is through the Oregon PTA website under events. We have our Oregon PTA Legislative Committee, which is basically a group of volunteers preparing events like this, looking at the policy positions that we have as PTA, looking at how can we do the outreach to the more rural areas, how do we get everybody involved, and you can register there. I'll put the link to that in the chat. And then if you're in the Portland metro area, there's an in-person meeting from Families for Equity in Schools on April 3rd in a beer hall. And with that, thank you so much. I'll stop sharing. I'll stop recording.